Hello everyone, and thank you for attending this segment of the Calf Academy. And today what we're going to talk about is milk replacer feeding program selection. And specifically, we're going to spend some time talking about accelerated, or as I like to call them, enhanced feeding programs, and why they might be right for one of your customers or for a particular farm. So the way we're going to approach this is we're going to talk a little bit about the calf. We're going to talk about the calf's needs. We're going to talk about milk replacers and milk replacer differences, and then we're going to go into some different potential programs for milk replacer that could be fed on farm. We're going to talk about why some might be appropriate in some situations and why they might not be in other situations. So that's kind of the way we're going to tackle today's topic. In terms of the calf, we need to really keep in mind that calves are born monogastric. They are not ruminants when they are born. They do not have a fully functioning rumen. In all honesty, a young calf has a gut more similar to a human, a chicken, or a pig than it does to a lactating cow. This type of stomach that it has at birth really gives it a high capacity to digest milk early on in life. Really has the ability to utilize that nutrient and that feed quite well, and that's why milk and or milk replacer is really the primary source of nutrition for these calves in early life. It certainly is for quite some time, depending upon the milk replacer program, but also until grain intake or starter intake becomes appreciable, which really doesn't happen until week 3 or 4 of life. That grain is very, very important for rumen development, and as we all know with baby calves, rumen development is absolutely critical to make sure that that animal is successfully weaned. Again, as I just mentioned, our goal is to have adequate rumen development by the time this calf is done with the pre-weaning phase. When the calf is born, the calf's stomach, primary compartment in the calf's stomach at that point is the abomasum, which makes up 60% of the stomach. And that compartment is designed for milk digestion. And it's not until we start to get this early starter intake that we really are stimulating rumen development in that calf. Because as we know in the adult cow, the mature stomach is the rumen makes up 80% of the stomach. So now the rumen becomes the primary component, whereas in the calf, the abomasum was the primary component. Now the difference here, while the abomasum is primarily designed for milk digestion, the stomach, or the rumen compartment of the stomach, can really handle forage digestion well, and it also is home to multiple bacteria that we are also feeding along with the GI tract of the animal. When we're feeding the calf milk or milk replacer, milk consumption stimulates the closure of the esophageal groove. That's an important concept. A lot of people think that the esophageal groove is actually kind of magically opening and allowing milk to enter it. And really what's happening is that groove is closing off other parts of the animal so that milk is going down the esophageal groove and into the abomasum of the calf. So it is a closure of that groove. This allows milk to bypass the rumen when suckling is initiated. The suckling is what stimulates the closure of the groove. When the calf drinks water out of a bucket, it does allow that water to go to the rumen. It's very important that we offer free choice water early on, because free choice water is very important to support rumen fermentation, and we also know that water intake and starter intake go hand in hand and are highly correlated. The real concept to understand when we're thinking about selecting a milk replacer or milk program for our calves is what's influencing that growth. That growth is really made up of genetics and their genetic potential, the environment with which the calf is raised in, the nutrition we provide to the calf, and the health status of that animal. So when we're looking at some of these things, obviously the breed is going to fall under that genetic pool. Is it a Holstein? Is it a Jersey? Is it a different breed? And also the source of the calves is also going to play a role in genetics, because we know that some farms have different breeding goals than others. When we look at the source of the calves, though, we can be getting calves from sale barns, we can be getting calves from multiple dairies, we can be getting calves from single dairies, and that's going to fall into the other 3 components. That environment with which the calf was born and raised in prior to arriving to the farm, the nutrition that the calf may have received, and also the colostrum status. We don't know if this calf may or may not have received colostrum, prior to being in the control of the feeder. So that falls into the health pool as well. And further, the colostrum status also goes into the nutrition, because although we know that IgGs and antibodies are an important component of colostrum, certainly the protein and fat and other ingredients or other components of colostrum are very, very important nutritionally. And finally, our housing situation in terms of, is this an all-in, all-out facility? Are calves continually introduced? How are we sanitizing it? What's the ventilation and air quality like? That's going to play further into environment and also is going to have an impact on health. So as we can see here, we have these 4 areas of the calf that the calf is continually integrated with that are really going to influence how that calf is able to grow. And we need to find the balance and understand all 4 of these components when we're designing a milk replacer program for a particular operation or a particular set of calves. Another thing for us to understand, and this builds off of our last slide a little bit, is what type of calf are we feeding? Is this calf raised on farm? If this calf is raised on the farm that we're working with, we probably have a pretty good idea of that calf's colostrum status, and that producer is also going to have a pretty darn good idea of what our pathogen load is. We also know what the goals of that producer are, and it's going to be very easy for us to fit a program to meet those goals. This is also, especially in a dairy operation, where we can have the conversation that by feeding a higher plan of nutrition, we may have the opportunity for them to produce more milk by growing at a faster rate in early life. We're going to hit on that more later, but what's important here is that this producer is raising their own calves. They have direct control over the decision process, and seeing those calves grow well is hopefully very important to them. When we look at a large calf ranch, or really any calf ranch, we generally know the source of the calves, so we know colostrum status, but our pathogen load is a lot different here because we now are dealing with calves potentially from multiple sites, and we certainly had to bring the calves to this farm or this operation, which is another opportunity for pathogen load to become an issue. In addition, we're dealing with a contract oftentimes with these calf ranches, and with that, we don't know how that contract is being handled. Is this individual receiving just a set amount of money per calf per day? If that's the case, there's really not an incentive to feed an enhanced program in these operations. Or are they being compensated for growth? Additionally, what we have to take into consideration with these animals is what are these animals looking like when they arrive, and how old are they when they arrive? If we go on to our bull calves, calves that are arriving as dairy beef potentially, we have 2 options here. Either all calves arriving from one farm, a relationship between a rearer and a farmer, or we have calves arriving from multiple sites. If it's single source bull calves, again, we probably have a decent idea of colostrum status and the pathogens present at that farm. But at the same time, we're also dealing with the fact that these animals were most likely shipped. So we do have to deal with that. And they're going to a new environment. Even though all the animals at this new environment are from one source, we still have to deal with that. The conversation we can have with these individuals is we can be much more specific and cater to the animal's needs, since we more than likely know a lot about it. And we can really use that as an opportunity to have a conversation with these guys to maximize early growth for these calves. Where it gets a little bit tricky is when we're dealing with bull calves from multiple sources, for example, a sale barn. In this situation, colostrum status is unknown and pathogen load is very high. So in this situation, sometimes it is kind of a trial and error type scenario where we're working a lot with nutritional support, feeding the calves as much as we comfortably can to allow them to use those nutrients to support their immune system. But we're also probably going to want to look at potentially adding some additives to help calves and help their immune system to really deal with this pathogen load. It's these calves from multiple sources, these bull calves, that we find often struggle the most during the milk-fed stage. So now let's talk about choosing a milk replacer. There's a lot of things for us to consider when we're picking a milk replacer program. The first thing, and this will be covered more in a different Calf Academy module, but is the protein source. Are we going to be looking at milk proteins, all milk proteins, partial milk proteins with other proteins included? Are we going to include animal plasma? Or are we going to include proteins such as soy or wheat proteins? Additionally, we need to consider the protein and fat content, or the protein to fat ratio. And really, this should be influenced by the targeted feeding rate and the targeted growth objectives for these calves or for this farm. Next, we have to worry about considering antibiotics or other medications. Antibiotics are becoming more and more regulated in the milk replacer, but coccidiostats are very useful things that we can add to the milk replacer and make a big difference. And then we also need to consider other additives that we might want to see included in our milk replacers, such as direct-fed microbials or mannose oligosaccharides. As mentioned, there's multiple protein sources that we can look at in milk replacer for calf consumption. Our gold standards are our milk proteins, such as whey protein concentrate, dried skim milk, things like that, and also animal plasma. While I would never like to see animal plasma be the majority of the protein source in a milk replacer, animal plasma does have some very great health benefits to the calf. There's antibodies in plasma, similar to that in colostrum, that have a local health benefit in the gut. There are a couple other milk proteins that you may commonly see or may consider. They tend to be a little bit cheaper than the ideal alternatives, and those would be soy protein isolate, soy protein concentrate, modified soy flour, and some wheat proteins as well. We talk about marginal, or as I like to call them, unacceptable. Unacceptable protein sources would be soy flour, which is just a fancy way of saying finely ground soybean meal. Egg protein would be another one. Egg protein can be very, very damaging to calves when it's even as low as 5 to 10% of the protein. And another one would be blood or meat proteins. There was a study conducted at the University of Minnesota in Waseca to look at the impacts of adding different protein sources to milk replacers. So if you'll look here on the left, we do have a figure with our 3 treatments. The dark blue bar is our treatment 1, which is a 20/20 all milk protein formula. The middle bar, our treatment 2, is a 20/20 milk replacer where 50% of that protein was replaced with soy protein concentrate. And then our far right bar is the same type of scenario where we have a 20/20 protein where 50% of the all milk fraction was replaced with wheat gluten. They looked at performance of these calves, and the data reported here is day 1 to 56. So as you can see here, the all milk formula had the greatest gains and the greatest starter intake during the 56-day trial period. Both our soy protein concentrate and our wheat gluten milk replacers had what I would call comparable and acceptable growth, but it was not the same type of growth that we saw in the all milk formula. This is an important concept to understand. We can get a milk replacer that is cheaper by changing some of the protein ingredients, but when we lose what we gain on price, we often lose on performance. Now, this is an important concept to consider depending upon the goals and objectives of the operation you're working with. This might be something that they would consider, as perhaps growth is not as much of an objective for this particular operation. So when we talk about potential medications and additives, there's a lot of different ways that we can approach this. When we're talking about things from a prevention standpoint, certainly our coccidiostats can play a very big role here. Those are things such as Bovatec or Decox. I do recommend that when we are considering adding Bovatec or Decox to a milk replacer, that you take into consideration if there is any sort of coccidiostat in the starter on that farm. I find it appropriate to try to make sure those are synchronized. Additionally, there are a lot of non-medicated health additives that could also be used, such as mannose oligosaccharides, direct-fed microbials, essential oils, things like that. A lot of those products can be relatively cheap and have a pretty good impact. Now, when we're not talking about prevention and we're moving on to moderate stress, what I would talk about and recommend to a producer in that situation is making sure that animal plasma is a component of the milk replacer. We find that animal plasma does a great job in helping those calves that are going through stress, perhaps group-housed calves, calves that are coming from multiple sources, or calves that just have been or will be shipped long distances soon. Auto feeders is a great place for plasma-based milk replacers. Additionally, there are other ad packs that have a combination of different molecules and different ingredients that can be used in a moderate stress situation. When we get to a high immune stress situation, at this point, we're going to want to look at adding something pretty stout, such as a plasma-based ad pack. Again, these plasma-based milk replacers also work well in these situations. If you know you're going to have a high stress situation, certainly recommend that those be fed well before the incident of stress. Additionally, NT milk replacers can be used in this scenario. As I'm sure you're all aware, the veterinary feed directive does require us to have a VFD to feed these products, and we are only legally allowed to feed them for one 7 to 14 day period. But they are very efficacious in dealing with heavy immune insults in baby calves. Now let's move on to actually talking about different milk replacer feeding programs. I want to start with a disclaimer that a lot of what I will be saying is general definitions, as there's always exceptions to the rule and things can always differ based off region of the country and company or even producer. When we're talking about milk replacer feeding programs, a conventional milk replacer is generally your 20/20 fed at roughly a pound of powder per calf per day. Now that can range from a 20 to a 22% protein, and fat might even be lower than 20%. It might be a little bit higher, and our feeding rate can range up to a pound and a half. But what we're focusing on with this type of program is minimizing milk replacer intake to encourage maximal starter intake as early as possible. When we talk about a moderate milk replacer feeding program, those again are something around your 22 to 26 20s. So here we're talking about anywhere from 22 to 26% protein, 24 is very, very common, and that 20% fat. In addition, these products are fed at a little bit higher of a rate, say around that 1.5 to 2 pounds per calf per day, but I think you find them more often a little below 2 pounds. Here what we're looking for is trying to find a happy balance between milk replacer and starter intake. Then we have our accelerated programs, and I think accelerated is a very, very dirty word. I like to see that called enhanced or full potential feeding or biologically normal. But here these products generally have 26, 28, 30% protein and 28% fat, but again, that can be very flexible. When we're talking about enhanced feeding programs, we're generally focused on that 2+ pounds per day. 2.5 pounds is very, very common, but anything really above 2 pounds of powder per day would be an enhanced or an accelerated feeding program. The goal here is to maximize milk replacer intake while keeping starter intake minimal, at least during the early pre-weaning period. One way that we can effectively choose a milk replacer feeding program is by using the NRC model to predict our gains. When we look at each program, we can evaluate it on a for gain and a protein allowed for gain basis. So now what this is doing is we're entering in our milk replacer, and we are also entering in a feeding rate. And it's going to give us two values that are of importance to us. One is the amount of gain that we can achieve from energy, fat and lactose. The other is the amount of gain that we can achieve from protein. And those are two numbers. They're going to be in pounds per day. And whatever number is lower, that is the number that will correlate to what the calf is predicted to gain. So say protein is 2 and energy is 1.5 pounds per day, the calf will gain 1.5 because that is how much energy is allowing her to gain. That would also indicate in this scenario that that energy is the limiting nutrient. Now our goal is to figure out where protein and energy allowable gain are the same, so that we are growing the calf efficiently, that calf is gaining at an efficient rate. I'm going to show you some examples of that now, and this is an example of a conventional feeding program. So on the left we have average daily gain in pounds per day, and on the bottom you can see our x-axis is feeding rate in terms of pounds of powder. Our red bar is energy allowable gain, and our blue bar is protein allowable gain. So you can see when we feed a conventional feeding program at a pound of powder per day, energy is our limiting nutrient. When we feed at very, very high rates, protein becomes our limiting nutrient. But when we feed at 1.25 pounds of powder per day, we get our protein and energy allowable gain to be equal, but at right about that 0.75 pounds of gain per day. And this is obviously not including starter. It's important to realize. But that's where we get our most efficient gain with a conventional program. So if those are the type of growth objectives for a herd, this is the type of program to consider. When we now look at a moderate feeding program, we look at energy allowable gain by the red bar and protein allowable gain in the blue bar. Here, our growth is actually maximized somewhere between 1.25 and 1.5 pounds of powder per day. So here, without starter intake, again, that's very important, we are gaining closer to a pound of gain per day. So we've been able to increase gain by feeding a moderate feeding program. This slide would be the same setup as our previous two, but looking at an accelerated feeding program. And here, again, important to understand, we're not accounting for starter intake, but throughout pretty much no matter what rate we feed at, our energy is our limiting nutrient. But when we get up to a 3 pounds per day intake, we also are very close to 3 pounds per day average daily gain. This is where our efficiencies are equal for energy and protein allowable gain. So by feeding a program like this, we're achieving much, much higher rates of gain. Now again, it's important to realize that starter is not accounted for, and it's also important to realize that this is an estimation. All three of these are estimations, and we know that a lot of our different factors can influence how a calf will gain. Most importantly, this is in perfect conditions where calves are not getting sick. So certainly if we have a health insult or an immune challenge to the immune status, these things are gonna be impacted and our growth will be decreased. But the point of these three slides is to show that really in our accelerated or enhanced feeding program, we were able to get an efficient gain at a much, much higher average daily gain, which allows us to grow a larger animal, which is very much the goal of a lot of producers in our industry. When we directly compare a conventional versus an accelerated program, there's pros and cons to both. In a conventional program, we certainly have a decrease in the cost of our milk replacer. These programs are very easy to manage, and we get early starter consumption, so we get that animal transitioning to a fully functional ruminant much, much earlier. In terms of enhanced feeding, we're going to get the growth. We're going to get more growth out of our calves than in a conventional system. In addition, we do know that the maximal protein to fat ratio for lean gain is 1.4 to 1, which is a 28% protein, 20% fat. So we really are encouraging efficient lean gain when we feed an enhanced program. Additionally, this type of feeding would resemble whole milk feeding, what mom would produce, much, much more closely than a conventional or even a moderate program would. We also have the potential to shorten our time to puberty and first calving, and by providing extra nutrients to these calves, they have extra groceries to help battle immune insults as they present themselves. So now what are our cons of conventional and enhanced feeding programs? Well, for conventional, we obviously have the opportunity that this calf might not reach its genetic potential in terms of growth rate. We're not allowing the calf to consume as much as it normally would from mom, so we're going to have a decrease in growth. In terms of cons for the enhanced program, there's a debate out there whether the return on investment is there and whether the long-term effects in terms of lactation and reproduction are realized. There's a lot of research out there, but the jury is still out. In addition, we have an increase in milk replacer costs compared to a traditional feeding program. These programs generally require a higher level of management to make sure that things run smoothly, and the producer really needs to buy in to this concept of enhanced growth and continue that through calving so that we don't see a drop-off in the post-weaning phase. In addition, another con would be that we do have a decrease in starter intake when we feed an enhanced program, at least early on. So when we talk about handling calves that are fed a conventional or a moderate or an enhanced or accelerated milk replacer program, the purpose of this figure is really, it's from a study done in 2009, and it's really just to show you that when we feed these calves, we have to manage them differently. When we feed a conventional or a moderate program, we can generally just start feeding those calves from day one pretty normally after they get colostrum and carry that through, step them down the week before weaning, and they're eating starter and we're good to go. It's a little bit different with an accelerated program. Calves generally can't consume the full amount that we want them to consume in early life, so for the first week and a half, we probably need to start at a lower milk replacer allowance, step that up, then we probably need to step them down over a longer period of time, or at least give them a little more time on milk which is common in enhanced feeding programs, but we really need to change the way in which we manage that weaning transition, because those calves are probably not consuming starter as well towards the end of the weaning period. So we really need to make sure that we're getting starter into them by the way we manage the weaning process, which is why you'll often see accelerated feeding programs. Those calves will be on milk for another week or two compared to their conventional and moderate fed counterparts. Some other things aside from weaning to consider with enhanced feeding programs is those calves are certainly going to need free choice to water, especially if there's mixing errors with the amount of powder they're consuming. They need the ability to have access to water to potentially counteract that. And you really need to focus when you are weaning to make sure that you are observing starter intake to make sure those calves are starter before they are weaned. And for that reason, we do not recommend feeding hay calves during the pre-weaning period, but especially in enhanced fed programs, because hay is used to boost musculature and we need to improve rumen development first. So we don't want those calves to get distracted by the hay. We want them to consume the starter. You also need to make sure that your customer is aware of the possibility to decrease age at first calving and that they're comfortable with it. The producer also needs to make sure that their housing and their management style are appropriate to help this program help these calves achieve their true genetic potential for growth. Just to talk a little bit more about weaning for calves fed in an accelerated program, again, make sure starter is always available, but really make sure that you are weaning based off how well the calves are consuming starter. We like to see 3 to 5 pounds of starter for 3 consecutive days before weaning, and we like to see you delay hay intake until the calf is off of milk and had time to adjust to a post-weaning diet. Again, hay develops the musculature of the rumen, and the starter develops the rumen epithelium, and we really need to make sure that that epithelium is up and running so that the calf can handle its post-weaning diet prior to weaning. Additionally, there might have to be certain considerations in terms of how we reduce milk levels in these calves. It certainly might need to be over a slower time, and it might require more than one step down. Just all depends on how starter intake is going in those calves. There's been a lot of research out there on feeding calves a higher plane of nutrition. What we have found is that when we're feeding calves more, the composition of that milk replacer heavily influences body composition. It gives us the opportunity for greater lean tissue growth and decreased fat deposition. But if we don't feed the right product, we might not always realize those benefits. In addition, our calves are going to grow at a greater rate, have greater gains, and because we're putting down more lean tissue, they're going to have increased height measurements as well. This is the same study from 2009. We just wanted to go into a little bit more detail on it. Did a really nice job of comparing control, moderate, and accelerated fed calves. And what we found here was that essentially, as we fed calves better, we had a reduction in the age at first calving, and we had a numerical reduction in age at calving in months. So what we found here was that when we fed calves better, they were able to calve in earlier, and they actually were able to produce more milk. So if you look at 305-day mature equivalent milk, this is in pounds, we had a little less than 2,000 pounds more milk, right around 1,500 pounds more milk from calves when we fed the enhanced or accelerated diet compared to that control diet. Now, the moderate diet was intermediary to those two, but we really achieved our full first lactation potential when we fed the accelerated program. This brings up a valid point because a lot of people are starting to buy into this concept of increasing first lactation milk yield by feeding our young calves better. So this is certainly a conversation to have with your customers. So after a couple studies like the previous began to show some really interesting data in terms of feeding calves better and getting more milk, there was a meta-analysis done by the Cornell University Research Herd. It's a very commonly cited article done by these researchers where they looked at a lot of different heifers reared on 2 different farms, and they looked at everything from birth weight, weaning weight, average daily gain, milk intake. They looked at a lot of different things, and what they were doing was they were looking at if those things influenced first lactation milk yield. And that's exactly what they found. What they found was that when we feed calves better, we get greater gain. And when gain is increased, first lactation milk yield is increased. So actually it was done on 2 separate farms, and what they found was that for every kilogram of increase in gain, so that would be 2.2 pounds, every time we increased gain, the overall gain for the pre-weaning period in our calves by 2.2 pounds, one farm had about a 500 pound and the other farm had about a 1,000 pound increase in first lactation milk yield. So what this tells us is you compare a calf that gains nothing during the pre-weaning period, it's just sick the whole time, doesn't gain, versus an animal that gains 2.2 pounds per day, we had a significant increase in milk yield. And what that told us was that early life gain influences how our calves produce milk in their first lactation. And obviously one of the best ways to influence early life gain is to feed a highly digestible and high quality milk diet. The question now is it worth it? Financially, does it make sense? And I'm showing you a lot of numbers here. Feel free to go through them on your own. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through them, but really I'm interested in showing you the differences between a control or a conservative feeding program and an enhanced feeding program, so our left and right set of numbers. The reason I do that is because the moderate program is intermediary to these two. So when you feed an enhanced program, you're going to get more gain and you get more efficiency of gain because you're feeding a highly digestible milk diet. But what we find is that milk replacer is more expensive than starter, so you have a higher cost per pound of gain. Obviously, when you feed an enhanced diet, that milk replacer tends to cost more and you're feeding more of it. So calves are consuming more milk replacers, so you have a higher milk replacer cost. And the reverse, when you feed an accelerated program, they're not eating as much starter, so there's a decrease in starter consumption. You don't pay for it as much there, but because milk replacer is so much more expensive than starter, generally, our costs for an accelerated program are generally higher to get that calf through the pre-weaning phase. Now these numbers are looking at day 1 to 56. So we are looking at about $100 difference to raise a calf for 56 days on an accelerated program compared to a control program or a conventional program, which is quite a bit of money when you multiply it across the number of calves we're raising in a year. So here is just one example of a budget you can do with your customers. We gave you some of the numbers before on what it costs to feed a calf enhanced fed program, and what we know is we'll use a conservative number here. When we feed calves better, they'll produce more milk down the road, and we're going to give that a 1,000 pound estimate. So when you look at $18 100 weight milk, that's $180 first lactation. Now I know that might not exactly be representative of the industry at all times, but we're going to use that number for this example. In addition, those animals tend to calve sooner. One study found about a month. So if we assume a value of $2 for every day sooner that animal calves, 30 days sooner at $2 per day is $60. So our total extra income is looking at our milk yield advantage and getting that animal to calve sooner. That's $240 per animal. When we look at our expenses, we have expenses in terms of feed during the nursery phase and early grower phase, and we also have some additional feed costs during lactation as a result of an animal that produces more milk. But if we do that math, we end up at $99 in expenses. If you take your $240 minus your $99, that leaves us with a net profit of just south of $110 per animal. So we invested more up front, but the animal did pay us back down the road. So here's the bottom line that we need to consider when we're talking with our customers. Accelerated feeding is not for everyone, nor should it be. It requires intensive management that is not required by a conventional program. However, it's really important to discuss the economics associated and some of the benefits, pros and cons to all these different programs to make sure that you find a feeding strategy that is right for this farm that you're working with, because ultimately it's got to work for the producer, it's got to work for their animals. And it's never going to be the same thing twice.
Thank you for completing this Calf Academy course. If you have follow-up questions, please contact your Milk Products National Account Manager.